Hello, everybody. I'm Philippe Sands, and welcome to Hay Festival's Book of the Month. Absolutely thrilled today that joining us is Ruth Corker Burks. You can see here a copy of the English edition of a wonderful book, which is just out very recently this month. All the Young Men is our Book of the Month. Copies will be available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, or you can buy a copy from your local bookseller. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. You can submit them on the relevant tab, questions on the website, and we'll do our best in due course to get through as many as we can. We've only got just under an hour, so I'll do as much as I can with questions. But I also personally thank everyone, every single one of you, who's donated to the festival's future in these incredibly difficult times when registering for this event. You can continue to support the festival by donating on the website. And just before I introduce Ruth, if I could let you know that the book of the month for February will be Francis Spufford's new novel, Light Perpetual, and there'll be a live Q&A on the 9th of February. Now, without further ado, may I introduce Ruth Corker Burks in faraway Arkansas.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you
Ruth,
so much for having me.
Ruth, we are thrilled to have you. You've written an extraordinary book, one that has touched me and I think has touched so many people who've read it. And we're going to have an opportunity to tell you, give an opportunity for you to tell your story that you've written in the book. But can we begin? Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're sitting and what part of the world you're in?
Well, I'm sitting in my living room in Northwest Arkansas. I live now about 4 hours from where the book takes place in Hot Springs, and I'm just having a nice life.
And before the events of the mid-1980s that you write about, when AIDS entered so many of our lives and entered your life in a very real way,
Right.
Tell us a little bit about your life before then, your childhood and the kind of existence that you had, your family, and just to situate you.
Right. Well, my daddy took care of me until 1959, and he was 60 years older than my mother, and she was not 60 years older, sorry about that, 20 years older. He was 60 when I was born, and my mother was 40. And they married, I think she was like 35 or something. And anyway, he told her that he wanted a baby girl, and so here I am. And when I was 6 months old, they incarcerated my mother. They took her in handcuffs away to a tuberculosis sanatorium, hours and hours and hours up in the mountains. The doctors had said, she was a nurse and she knew she didn't have TB, but the doctors were convinced that she did. So they sent her home just in time for Daddy to die, because he was dying when I was born. He had emphysema, end stages. And so it was kind of a business deal that she would take care of him until he died. And, he would leave her his pension and me. And we didn't know each other when she came home. She came home very ill. They found out that she only had, there was only 3 cases in the United States of this very rare lung disease. So, she came home very sick and had a, 5-year-old to have to take care of. And she just wasn't equipped to be a mother.
Yeah. And then your childhood, and what working life did you have? I mean, you were, by the time AIDS came on the scene in the mid-80s, you were in your early 30s. Tell us about your life in the immediate times before, and then
well,
changes.
I was 25 when it came along into my life, and I was selling real estate, and just whatever you have to do to make a living as a single woman in Arkansas, I did. My only requirement for a job is it had to be legal and vertical, and that was just for me. I didn't care how anybody else made a living, but those were my only rules.
Legal and vertical.
Yes.
And your family also had this ownership of a part of the story that becomes very important. Can you tell us a little bit about the family cemetery?
My mother, I guess we could generously call her, what is it? Eccentric. That's it, eccentric. And so she and my uncle had this war going on for 40 years before I was ever born. So when I was 10, my mother, he had been in an awful fight with my grandmother. So my mother she went to the lady that took care of the cemetery and bought 262 grave spaces so he couldn't be buried with the rest of her family. And she had her monument put up that said, "Woe be unto ye hypocrites, Pharisees, and scribes." And it's a paraphrased out of, I think, Second Timothy. But anyway, she goes, and that's for your Uncle Fred too. So, who would ever think that there would come a time when, I'm an only child. What was I going to do with all those grave spaces? And who would think that, in just a few years, this awful plague would happen where people didn't even want their children to bury them because of the shame.
Can we go back to the beginning of the book, in a sense? The book opens very powerfully with one of the opening days of what you've called the plague hit. How did you come to be in that hospital on that day? And can you take us through what happened exactly on that day? And I can follow up then with a couple of reflections.
I had a friend. She lived 25 years past her cancer diagnosis and she's living. So Bonnie's where, we learned all of this together. And I was at the hospital. She had oral cancer, so I was doing her translating for her. And I had noticed that these nurses, this big red bag had gone up on this door. No entry, biohazard, and all of that. And they had a little cart with a paper gown and, hat covers and all of that on it. And the nurses were drawing straws. 3 nurses were drawing straws to see who would go in and check on this young man. And, we were friends up there. Bonnie had all of her reconstructive surgeries on that floor. And, I would bake cookies and take them up and we'd all eat out of the same Ziploc bag. And, we were friends. And so I just could not believe what I was seeing out of these women. And then when they drew straws the second time, they all just kind of disappeared down the hallways and no one went in to check on him. And his food trays were stacking up outside the door. And I just couldn't stand it one more minute. And I snuck into his room. And that's when I found Jimmy. And he was so frail and he was so tiny in that bed. I could barely tell him from the sheets.
And what did you understand about his situation and what did you learn on that first day?
Well, I had heard about AIDS. I have a cousin in Hawaii who was gay. He still is, and he's still living and never caught HIV, thankfully. But so I knew about it, and but I didn't know much because it wasn't mentioned until 1985, I believe. In July of that year was the first article in Time magazine about this horrible disease, but I'd heard whispers about it, and every now and then you would see something on TV that, like 9 gay men have this horrible, birthmark scar on their face, the Kaposi sarcoma. And, I had very limited knowledge, but I knew that there was a human being on the other side of that door that was being brutally ignored, and I wasn't going to stand for that. So I had to go in.
And what, when you look back, what was it that motivated you, and how did the nurses and the others around react to a person like you of singular intent, absolutely committed to doing the right thing in circumstances that was causing so much difficulty for others?
I just have always known that it was the hand of God that sent me into that room. And I've always felt like that I was doing what he asked of us to do in the Bible, what Jesus, the red lines in the Bible, Jesus said, take care of the sick, take care of the hungry, take care of the people that need taking care of. And I had always, grown up knowing that. And if I would sit in and hear the most beautiful sermons on Sunday morning about the same thing, I'm Methodist and we don't have enough religion to offend anyone. And I like that about a church. I don't want to go in and have them fuss at me about, not bringing enough people to church. I want to go out and practice what they tell me to do. And I'm raising a young daughter to do what the Bible tells us to do. And it was horrible how we were treated. It was horrible. The nurses, they backed up, and I just wanted, when I went into his room and I took his hand and I said, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" He said he wanted his mama. Well, that's easy. That's simple. I can do that. And I, announced that, he wanted his mother. And that's when everything changed. They all backed up, and like I had just been splattered with vomit. And the looks on their faces, I'll never forget. And they go, "You didn't go into that room, did you? His mother. So can y'all call him?" And they said, "Honey, his mama's not coming. Nobody's coming. He's been here 6 weeks. Nobody's coming." And I thought, wow, what am I going to do now? So I asked for his mother's phone number. If they weren't going to call her, I was. And so I reached for the phone on the desk, which I'd used for years. And so they said, "No, the payphone is down the hall." And I thought, oh my gosh, we've come to this. So I, found a dime and I went down there and put it in the phone, and I called her, and she goes, "I don't know what you have at that hospital, but it's not my son. My son died years ago. Don't call me back." And hung up on me. And I thought, oh no, you're not going to hang up on me. So I called her back. And I told her that if she hung up on me one more time, I'd put her son's obituary in their hometown newspaper and I would list his cause of death. I had her complete attention. And she said, "My son died years ago when he went gay, and I don't know what that thing is you have up there, but it's not my son. So don't even call me back when he dies." And she hung up on me again, but I let it go. And the nurses, they were watching me like a hawk. And I thought, no, I'm not going to let them know that they got me. So I just straightened myself up and put a smile on my face and went back into his room without putting all that. I wasn't going to get AIDS from my hair or from my shoes. And so I went back in and I took his hand, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Mama, I knew you'd come." What do you do then? What do you do? I thought, oh my gosh, I'm what? And so I went back to my friend Bonnie, and I was hoping she would say, oh, I'm in a lot of pain. I need you. But no, not Bonnie. She wrote on a pad, I'm fine. He's not. Go back in there with him. So that's how it started. And
Can you say a
I
bit
stayed
more?
with him for 13 hours. And
You say a bit more about the conditions in a community that cause that kind of reaction to happen, that causes a mother to react as she did, and the nurses to react as they did. How do you explain that? Remember, you're speaking to an audience in Britain. We have similar things, I think, in Britain, in this country, but we don't know Arkansas. What are the values? What are the feelings that could give rise to a situation that is very painful, even to hear as you recount it?
well, and I don't know how other religions um, would handle a situation like this back then, but the Christian community over here, it was just horrible, absolutely horrible. And they it came from the churches, it came out of the pulpits is where it came from, and the families are so indoctrinated into the hate of a over here. And that's where it came from. That's where the homophobia came from, which I actually think was the worst. I think that AIDS was just, they go, oh, well, that's their punishment. God created that disease to take them down, and that's their punishment for being gay, was being gay. That's when they threw you out of your church and out of your home and everywhere, was when they found out that you were gay.
So that was 1985, 1986. I want to come back to your story, but
Right.
today we're in 2021. It's 35 years ago. Would it happen differently today if you were in that situation? Has anything changed, or do you think it's essentially the same?
It did change for a long time. Things got so much better. And then we got President Trump. And I really even hate to use president in front of his name. But I have friends from all over the world who would not come to the United States before COVID because they were afraid of Trump and how he let everything get out of hand, and his hatred for the LGBTQ plus community was just, President Biden just yesterday signed a document that allowed the transgender people back in the military. And so, but Trump had thrown them out, and everybody was just on such thin ice and on tippy toes over here that, it's been an awful 4 years.
I mean, I wasn't going to yet get into this, but since you've raised it, I'm going to seize the moment. Mr. Trump got 70 million votes, including a majority in Arkansas. How do you explain that? I mean, he lost, but the support was nevertheless enormous. For a British audience, how do you explain what is happening now, and what's the connection with what you experienced in 1985?
What it did is it brought out the true people. People have always had prejudice over here, and in Arkansas, we're a very rural town. I think we only have about maybe 2 million people in the entire state, and back then we had about 250,000 back then. But it's I don't know why people hate the LGBT community as much as they do, because I have found through 35 years of research, I suppose, I was researching, but I found the LGBTQ plus family to be closer to the body of Christ than any of the people sitting in church on Sunday mornings. And I truly feel that. I don't believe it, I feel it. I know that's the truth. And there's something about being kind and thoughtful and caring and loving to your fellow man that just scares the bejesus out of Christians. And they just can't handle it. But they're this hate. I mean, I remember when I was a little girl, I was in second grade and I had the Sunday school frosted so you couldn't see out because they didn't dare want you daydreaming. And I remember the teachers saying, oh, well, you know, everybody that doesn't go to this particular little tiny Baptist church, you know, this particular church are going to hell. And I said, well, what about the cat? He goes, oh, well, they worship Mary and burn candles. They're going to hell. Well, what about the Jewish children? Oh, well, they killed Jesus. They're going to hell. I mean, I'm talking about second graders. So they indoctrinate it into you very early on. And hate begets hate.
Yeah. And it hasn't changed that much, you're saying?
Not really, not at this time. But the good thing about Trump's administration, we found out who our allies are. And that's much more important to know than who your enemies are. Because your enemies can change, but not your allies.
Can we go back to Jimmy and what happened afterwards? It's a very powerful story that you've just described, and you tell it very beautifully in the book. You spent 13 hours with him. You were with him when he died. What happened to you then? What was the effect of that on your being and the direction that you felt you wanted to take?
Well, it changed everything for me. And I didn't realize a lot of the things that changed for me, but you know, I took Jimmy and I had to, you know, he was mine essentially then, and I paid to have him cremated. And I never thought about, you know, how he would come back to me, but he came to me through the mail, through the post in a cardboard box, which is how they send cremated remains over here, in a plastic bag. And I just couldn't bury that box in the ground like that. He needed dignity. So I have a friend who has a pottery shop, and I asked him if he had a cookie jar that he couldn't sell. Maybe it had a chip in it or it didn't fire right. And so he gave it to me, and I took it home and I put Jimmy in it and I sealed it up. And I took him to the cemetery and I buried him in my family's plots.
And the family cemetery started to play a really significant role in your life in a way, presumably, neither your mother nor you could ever have expected.
No.
How do you explain where this came from? What was going on within you? Did it surprise you, the passion, the energy that drove you? Because you didn't stop after that, quite the opposite.
Well, how could I? I mean, what do you tell the next person? I'm sorry you're dying, but go find somebody else to help you, because it was not going to get any better than this. I knew how, you know, how society treated. Back then, it was just gay men at the point, you know, but I knew how they treated gay men. I heard what other straight people said about the gay community. You know, I heard it everywhere as a straight person. And so I knew what they thought of them. And I knew that if I didn't do it, there was no one left to do it. Because they had been taking care of each other. They had been taking care of it would have been their husband back then, but we called it, you know, everybody called it their lovers, but they were taking care of their lovers who died, and then taking care of a friend who died, just so they would have a place to live until they, you know, they kind of couch surfed their way down to the bottom to where there weren't any more couches left, because all of their friends had already died and they were dying. And they came home knowing that if they came home weighing less than 100 pounds, that surely their mothers would take them back in. But they didn't.
What happened sort of organizationally? You then effectively took your compassion forward and people started coming to you, as you described it in the book. What were the main challenges that you faced at that point in the mid-1980s and the late 1980s, and how did it change over time?
You mean the challenges with the church and with the people in town? I had to find them food. Yeah, I had to find them food. I had to find them housing. I had to find them medical treatment, and there was none. And I had to find them everything that they had. And, you know, when someone would die, I would inherit their medication. And you know, it was almost impossible to get an AIDS patient on pain medication back then because they thought, well, you know, they deserve whatever they're in, and surely they don't have any feelings. So they wouldn't even give them pain medication in the hospitals. It was horrible. But I kept a collection of, or if somebody couldn't take their medication, if they had side effects, I would keep their medication. I had a whole pantry full of it because, you know, people would come home to die and they couldn't get the medication they were on because the pharmacist, number one, we couldn't find a doctor that would help them. And number two, the pharmacist would tell me, I know what this is for, and don't ever come back in here again.
I mean, what you're describing, as you do in the book, is almost unbearable, and it's very, very hard to comprehend at the human level. What I'm looking for is, which you describe in the book, but I prefer to hear you talk about it, the rays of light, the crack of light, when you began all of a sudden to see that there were people out there that you could turn to, because things did change with some people.
Yes. And I found that the church that I went to had all of the people in town. If you were anybody in town, you know, you were the mayor or whoever you were, the doctors, they all went to my church. And they were the quiet ones who would come to me later, you know, and just let me know. They didn't say anything, but it was just like a look that they would give me, that I knew that I could trust them. It, like my banker, and he was so precious and so wonderful to me, and he would have a air ambulance waiting for me. I mean, I wouldn't even be out of his office before it would be, you know, ready at the airport to go pick someone up. Or, you know, the dry cleaners who just, you know, he was a quiet man and no one would ever know he was a sniper in World War II. But, you know, he would see that utilities were turned on or people had food or their clothes were clean. And I had people throughout town that did that, but no one, I never outed anybody, straight or gay.
And what has HIV crossed out of the gay LGBTQ community into the straight community? Did that begin to change people's attitudes, or not as much as you would have thought?
Not as much as I would have thought, because the straight people in town that got it weren't straight, and but they were married and had 5 kids, because you couldn't any kind of a business down here because it, you know, no one, you'd be run out of town on a rail. And so you had to be on the down low. And I had this one woman and her husband died of AIDS, and we were at this little dinner party one, you know, later. Well, he got it from a blood transfusion in 1984. And I had to take her in the kitchen and say, they didn't have tests until March of 85. So she goes, oh yeah, she went right back out and changed her date because she didn't want anybody to know that, you know, he could have possibly gotten it any other way. And the straight community just never paid any attention. They just thought, no, it's not getting into the straight community.
So you also begin to occupy this extraordinary position in a relatively small community as the holder of secrets, of rather intimate secrets. As people are talking to you,
Yes.
friends, their lovers, and there is an underground life in the community that the community doesn't want to know about.
Absolutely. And the women in town hated me. The men all came to me for safer sex tips. And, you know, most of the men had even my age, you know, you have to remember that we were in our 20s and 30s and we had birth control. So no one ever, and we didn't have HIV. So, you know, all you had to worry about was getting pregnant. And that's all the man had to worry about was getting a woman pregnant. So, you know, you had birth control pills. You didn't have to worry about pregnancy. So you could have all the unsafe sex that you wanted because no one at the time knew it was unsafe. And I think that, you know, and then I knew who everybody in town was sleeping with because if they didn't tell me, somebody else would. And one time Billy was in the bathroom and he had locked himself in there, and I went over and he had the phone book and the telephone and a legal pad, and he was writing down the names of everybody that he had ever slept with, calling whoever and whoever answered the phone, whether it's his wife or child, or, oh, I have AIDS and I slept with husband. And he'd hang up and call the next person because his mind was so far gone. And he said, oh, yeah, I made a list for you, too. And I'm like, I don't need a list, Billy. I don't want to know.
I mean, it's an extraordinary story at so many levels. I mean, what you've just described about Billy, and I want to ask you a question about him in a moment, is it's a sort of modern form of contact tracing, but one
right.
has for the recipient family. I mean, I'm imagining the wife picking up the telephone and hearing this being thrust down the telephone to her by dear Billy, who you described so beautifully. How does the wife in your community react to that information? What does your wife?
Oh, I know.
What does the wife do?
Yeah, could you? I'm sorry.
What does the wife do armed with that information?
Oh, she goes nuts and usually would call me like I had anything to do with it. And of course, I didn't know what she was talking about. And, you know, she was going to get that information from somebody except me. And so I just played innocent and dumb. And, you know, but if her husband's sleeping around on her that much, she should have already known that.
But she would have presumably drawn a distinction between her husband sleeping with other women, which might be unacceptable, but less unacceptable than sleeping with men.
Oh, exactly, because her husband's not that kind of a man at all. And oh yeah, and she usually thought they were sleeping with me. And I'm just kind of like, why would I want your husband?
It's just
seriously, I didn't even want my own.
You are an incredible storyteller, Ruth, and just an incredible compassion. You. And on the subject of compassion, one of the most amazing characters in your book is Billy. Can you tell us about Billy? Tell this audience, this wonderful audience, about Billy, because it's an extraordinary story.
Because what? I lost you.
He's
there.
An extraordinary person, and it's an extraordinary
story.
Oh,
isn't he? Billy was magical. Billy was that once in a lifetime comet that you get to see. But I was lucky enough to know it was a once in a lifetime comet. And he was the brightest star on the stage, and he was very quiet and meek. And you would never know that he did anything extraordinary, but he was such a beautiful man and such a beautiful woman. And he just had the it quality. He just had it. and he wanted to share it with the. He's famous all over the world. There's nothing that would make him any happier than to have all eyes on him, and look at him now.
Well, we're talking about him and we're evoking his spirit in the most positive way
Yes,
imaginable, because he was your friend.
yes, yes. I knew him before he got well, before he knew he was sick, and he was so young that you just didn't even give it a thought. And I know the situation behind it, and the timeline wraps up right for it to have happened to him early in his life. But he was just so special, and he was not going to die. He didn't ever say, "Oh, I'm not going to die," but he wasn't going to die. He knew that there would be, as all of my guys did. They all took their AZT the day they died, because they knew that day after tomorrow there'd be a vaccine, there would be a cure, and they just knew it would be in time for them.
No, that's an experience that many have spoken about. I'm going to start jumping to a few questions because we're getting so many questions from the audience, and I'm going to pepper them around. They come in all directions. So someone has asked, and I'm just reading it out. This person asks, I'd like to know more about your daughter. What was the impact of those early experiences on her adult life?
Well, I think they were, it was hard for her as a child to make friends with all of these beautiful, wonderful men and their companions and their partners and their friends, and then to lose them all. You make friends with them, you fall in love with them, like I did writing the book. That was what was so hard, because Kevin brought them back to life, to where I got to meet them all over again, and I got to fall in love with them, and I had to go through their deaths with them. And so she had to go through all of that too, growing up. And I think it was very hard on her, even though she won't admit it.
And how has she been now about the book? I should mention that Kevin is Kevin O'Leary, who you've co-written the book with. What does your daughter feel about the book, the fact that you've gone so very public with this story and it's had such a success?
Well, she's fine with it, because it's a story about my men, about my guys. And, we've always felt like we were just walk-on characters in a play, because it was their lives. And we would walk on periodically and bring them food or bring them medicine, but they were living their own lives.
Yeah.
And was that all? Did I even answer the question? I'm sorry.
You did answer the question. We suddenly slightly lost you. You're dropping out slightly, but I think we're okay.
Okay.
I'm coming to another question from EJ, and you've hinted at it in a certain sense.
Oh, EJ.
EJ has asked, what are your views on heaven and an afterlife, and how important is that concept for you?
Well, I think that you can live in hell right here on earth, because I've lived in hell many times, and I don't really have a concept of heaven and hell like most people do, because I think that when and I always felt this way when my men would die and I would take them back, I felt like there was a river I would trudge through, carrying them across to the other side, and I would hand them lovingly to the people who loved them the most and didn't judge them, and who they would be thrilled to see. And I handed them to Jesus and God, and it was just a beautiful moment. And I just leave them to that. And so that's what my idea of heaven is being around the people who really loved you the most. Doesn't that sound like heaven to you?
Well, it gets pretty close, Ruth. It gets pretty close. It's an extraordinary moment you described. Jane has asked about medications, and your story has gone on for decades, but Jane asks, what was it like when AZT medication came in for the people you helped in the and the even more recent medications, which really have not resolved the problem, but done a lot to stop it being a death sentence. What was
Right.
the
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. That's a great question because, AZT, really the only thing it did for my guys is it turned their fingernails black, but it gave them hope. And hope in a bottle is all you need sometimes. But when the other drugs came out, oh my gosh, it was a miracle. And yes, my dog is joining us for the question and answer session. But it was a miracle. But now we're finding out that a lot of the medications are causing. I have friends who have stage 4 bone cancer and kidney cancer from the HIV cocktails that they've had for the years. And people think, oh, well, I'll just take PrEP and I'll go have as much sex as I want. Well, they don't give it to you if you're under 25, unless you're at risk or a sex worker. And it's causing the same problems. It's wrecking their bodies. And you don't get another body, so you have to do the best you can with whatever issues you have. So it gave everybody a life, but there was a cost for it.
We're having this conversation in which your country and my country are in an extraordinarily difficult situation right now with COVID. Yeah. And Helen has asked, I think, what is a very pertinent question. Do you think from your experiences that there are ways we could be better caring for one another now in the COVID panic? What are the parallels with COVID, and what has your experience taught you about how we deal with COVID?
Oh, Helen, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. And we don't have control over the virus. The virus, you can't fight a virus because the virus always wins if you don't find ways to beat it. But just for individuals, I've thought about this and I've been asked, questions similar. And, you don't know, you may not know who your next door neighbor is, but you know their address. Send them a little note. Just, I live next door to you. Maybe we've never met, but I just wanted you to know that I'm here. And if you ever need anything, and maybe send it to several people on your street and, start a little mail chain, just checking up, just to have that human contact is so important. And we've got to take care of each other.
Can you just relate?
Not just in 1986. As it says on the book. No, we have to take care of each other. So you have to think of ways to reach out to people you know and people you don't know.
Just following on from Helen's question, I mean, one of the things that was very striking for us in the recent election in the United States was the political symbolism of wearing or not wearing a face mask. Oh. Can you explain that story to us from your perspective in Arkansas, because I assume you're part of that also. In your community, there will be some people who simply refuse to wear a face mask because it's an act of weakness or whatever. What's going on? Can you explain to us what's going on?
No, I can't explain that. That is the craziest thing I have ever heard of in my life. I don't understand this whole Trump thing and through the churches. I mean, how shameful of the churches. And they've got a lot of reckoning to do. So, and a lot of them are. But no, it became some kind of macho mask. Well, I've noticed in my state, because when President Biden came into office, he put in a mask mandate where you have to wear it on federal property or interstate transportation, planes or buses or anything, trains. And he's only been in not long, and we can see that our rates are already dropping a little bit. So, and in New York City, they are too. We just have to get the vaccines out. And of course, when Trump left office, he said, good luck, you're going to need it, in his going away speech. Well, he knew that, yeah, Biden was going to need luck, a lot of it, because our pantries had been stripped. There's no reserve vaccine over here for anyone. And the states didn't know it. They've already given out the first doses, and we don't know when the second dose will get there and if it'll get there in time. But he deliberately, who knows, maybe someone sold our stockpile of vaccines to somebody before they left office. We don't know what happened.
But what has been the reaction in Arkansas, where there are, I'm told, a lot of people who are anti-mask, to the idea that the federal government is now ordering them to take protective measures if they visit certain properties? Does it create a backlash, or are people coming to the realization that this is pretty serious?
I think both. Because I still see people being ugly to people at the grocery store because they don't want to wear a mask. And every now and then I'll pop in and I'll forget that I didn't put my mask on. I have to run right back out, but no one ever says, well, you need a mask on. So people are just afraid of that confrontation because, those people are nasty people. They're not nice people, and they will let you have it if they don't want to wear a mask. But even when I drove down, now the whole eastern part of the state is liberal and Democrat, and the whole western part is conservative Republican. And there's just, when I drove to Hot Springs, 4 hours of driving, we saw nothing but Trump flags all the way down there. So it'll take a while for his clutch on these people to wear off, but it's like some of these skinheads and QAnon and all those idiots are like, oh, well, he duped us. We didn't know this about him. I know I stormed the Capitol from him, but we didn't know it. So it's just really crazy political, but it's getting so much, we feel like we can. I've known of gay men who actually married women because they were so afraid of being gay with Trump in office.
Whoa, that is pretty big. Thomas asks a question. What lessons did you take away from your connection with the Billies and the Jimmies and the other men? How has your connection with Billy, with Jimmy, and with so many others, how has it changed the way you live?
I had a devastating stroke in 2000. Insurance canceled on me because they didn't want to pay for it, and they found something from like 1981 where I took an aspirin, but anyway, or something really stupid like that. And so they canceled on me, and I couldn't walk. I drugged the right side of my body. I couldn't talk. And my God, they told me I had a 70% chance of dying. So go home and die and let us know how it worked out. And my guys are what got me through that stroke. If they could live every day until they died, I was going to do the same thing. And I did. And, I put on a Randy Travis CD, Glory Train, and I just learned how to walk and talk all over again and read. If I hadn't have had Kevin Carr O'Leary as my co-writer, I never would have written this book. I would have taken it to my grave because I had so many people send me proposals, and Kevin just got it. He got it. He was so perfect. And this book would never be out if it wasn't for Kevin. So I want to always give a huge shout out to Kevin because he's part of the magic of this book.
You're one generous lady, Ruth Corker Burks, and I think you're inspiring all of us mightily. Did you expect the reaction when you wrote the book? Did you think you'd end up speaking to a festival in Wales with hundreds, if not thousands, of people listening to you? What's been the impact? It's your first book. What's been the impact of writing a book? We're a literary festival. Did you imagine?
Right. I know. No, I didn't. And I am 23% Welsh. So I just had my DNA tested. And so I'm very proud of that. And I'm English and Scottish, just a little tiny sliver. So I'm thinking that I was Viking back then. That's my part of Norwegian. But no, I never did. I had a psychic tell me in 1990 that someday my name would be recognized all over the world. And I thought he was just full of it. I thought, oh, yeah, right, I'm sure. No, I had no idea. But it thrills my heart that you all have taken Billy and Tim and Jim and Chip and Anhil into your hearts. And it just thrills me at, your generosity. And I'm just so happy.
Yeah, well, I've got to ask also, since we are a literary festival, are you a big reader or a modest reader, or you don't read? And what do you like to read?
Well, I used to read all the time, and I would have 2 or 3 books going at the same time, kind of like watching TV, and you change the channel and you take a break from one book and read another. And when I had my stroke, it took away the ability to read and concentrate like that. So I really miss reading. But no, I used to love historic novels, and I used to love romantic novels and medical books. I would read just about anything, but I love Danielle Steele, and I and the history of your wonderful queens over there and their ruling and your kings. And so I guess probably history is my favorite.
Yeah. I've got another. There's so many questions coming in. I've got another from Chris. Very important. LGBTQ plus rights are under attack. I would say serious attack in so many countries and so many parts of the world. What's your advice to the people in those countries who face the kind of discrimination and persecution and oppression that you described with your Jimmies and your Timmies and your Billies? What's your advice to those people in some of those countries, in Russia, in Uganda, in so many places?
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, it's just, thank you for that question. It's a brutal question. It is. And, I am not one that's great on advice, because I just, well, I don't know. People always ask me for advice, but I don't know. It's such a hard, I get emails from people all over all the time from these countries, and they've got to get out. They've got to, even coming to America under Trump was better than, where they lived. And on the world where, no people couldn't come in before, I'm talking about before COVID. But, they just have to fight for their rights the best they can and take whatever opportunities they can to live. You don't have to be militant and get out fighting in the streets, but just live the best life you can, the best way that you can. And I just, I wish I could give them some kind of great advice, but, like, be yourselves. And, when they can't be themselves, and that's just a hard question that I just don't think I'm equipped to answer, because that feels like to live in a country like that. But my heart just breaks for their situation.
What you describe in your book, though, you having, if you like, become a valued member, if you like, of that secret community in your own town, was you describe an incredibly rich community, an incredibly, not in a monetary sense, but a deep, spiritual, humane group of human beings who are helping each other and working together. And isn't that in part the answer to that question? It's about reaching out and building your own communities, even though you are facing incredible challenges.
You're exactly right. Exactly right. You have to do that. You have to find family where you find family. And here I am, a straight church going, mother. And we had all been warned about the LGBT community, and that they were just horrible, awful people, and to stay away from them and to shun them. And that's where I found the richest family in the world, the most generous people in the world. They had nothing, but they had love.
Yeah. Well,
They had love for their fellow man.
Well, that may be, unfortunately, where we have an appropriate moment to draw to a close. Ruth, Ruth Corker Burks, it's been just such a privilege to speak to you. You're far away from us in a distance sort of way, but you're very close to us in so many other ways. I want to, on behalf of everybody, just thank you warmly for writing your book, for giving us your time in your afternoon, in our evening, and to remind all the wonderful Hay Festival goers who are on for the Book of the Month. What a wonderful Book of the Month, that your book's available on the Hay Festival website or at any of your local independent bookstores. Please buy this book. It's an extraordinary story. You are, if I may say, an extraordinary human being, Ruth, and you uplift us. And in these difficult times, we really need that. We really need your story. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone out there. Thank you to everyone out there. And I hope you do get the book, and I hope that you get great meaning out of it. And I hope you also get some laughs out of it.